Hello, hello, hello. It is Monday Fun Day, and we are talking about centaurs. I am so excited, guys. I love this. We've all been waiting for it. So every Monday, if you're not aware, I do Monday Fun Day where I talk about whatever I want, and that is world building. And I am talking about world building for my story that is called Crow Story. And if you want to know more about it, there is a whole heckin' playlist. It's a great time. What's being drawn is not from my Crow story. What's being drawn is a webtoon that is also a novel called The Books of Ava, which you can check out. It's probably available on webtoon at this point, but it's also completed in novel form. That is my pitch. Crow Story, Centaurs. We've talked a lot about centaurs, and we're going to get into the nitty-gritties of it today. We are talking now about the province of Mistfall. So Mistfall exists within a major region, an empire known as the Divine Kingdom of the Lindworm. And they're a bunch of stinky jerks who are bad, and I'm sure that'll come up. There's a lot that goes on in Mistfall, and usually I would start by kind of going over that with you. However, there's a bunch of like little random other religions and stuff that is practiced in Mistfall, so I figured we could do a final roundup at the end of this journey. So not in this video, but in the next video I make. Today it's about centaurs, baby. Let's go. Centaurs used to make up a huge population. They used to spread wide and far across the land, but as the Divine Kingdom expanded, centaurs really got pushed back. There used to be a lot more culture, I guess. There used to be a lot of different little groups that exist. What I'm going to talk about now is kind of what remains of centaur beliefs, because centaur kind of defines just like a group of people that look like centaurs. For general kind of like understanding for this world, everyone exists on a spectrum between a mage and an animal, and each type of magic is associated with a different animal, and the more magic you have, the less like an animal you look like, and you know, the less magic you have, the more animal like you look like. So centaurs are very just low on magic, but they are the same species as everyone else. Everyone is the same species and can interbreed, and whether or not one is born with any quantity of magic is related to environmental factors. And it should be noted that as the Divine Kingdom expanded and moved through these centaur areas, they used to not be super magical, right? But it is not kind of like an inherent property like it is in some other areas that are really just kind of like black holes of magic almost. We talked about one of those last week. Instead, what's kind of happened is as the Divine Kingdom spread, it brought with it like magical artifacts and magical items, enchanted items, mounts of crystal, and also while it is environmental, one environmental factor is like whoever you gestated within, right? Like if you have a mage mother, you are going to experience a lot of like magic during your development. So like as these forces moved in, they also served as a force that kind of just eroded the existence of centaurs, even in less overt kind of ways. It just kind of really introduced a lot of magic outside of just, you know, like the killing and war that took place. What remains of centaur belief can kind of be divided into two groups. So there's like general centaur beliefs, which are beliefs that tend to be held even within the diaspora. So like different like groups of centaur that have moved outward. There's just a lot of displacement, obviously, because the kingdom came in and wiped out so much. So like, yeah, Centaur beliefs are just kind of like general, and they are slowly folded into the beliefs of the orthodoxy. That being said, they still are not appreciated, but they are more appreciated by the other form of Centaur beliefs, religion that exists, and that is Centaur witchcraft. And that is a lot more specific to the region of Mistfall. It used to be kind of like the major religion practiced there, whereas like if you moved further out, the beliefs would be different, but those have been erased, kind of. So we're going to talk generally first. So centaurs worship the bovine goddess Achel. So the traditional centaur beliefs are similar to some other hearth beliefs. Hearth is like the element of family and is associated with horses. So like that's the spectrum we were talking about earlier. So traditional centaur beliefs, they believe that the world was made when Eska, who is the nature god, slew Lechfang. And Lechfang is the lindworm, basically, a big snake, a greedy serpent that tried to swallow the entirety of everything. So Eska, the bear god, then fell asleep on top of this dead serpent, and the land then formed on Eska's back. So the whole world is on the back of this bear god who killed a worm and fell asleep. You know, busy day. Achel made the world habitable for souls that were displaced when Lechfang destroyed everything that had existed. So like there used to be like some sort of world that existed before, and the souls of that world were then collected by Achel, and Achel brought them to live atop Eska's back. The souls that were released, those were the centaur, and they stood on 4 hooves just like the goddess, and everything was good. Lechfang, the snake who died, came back from death twice, and this caused 2 great rivers to form on the land. Achel stopped Lechfang from living again, though. However, when the snake tried to come to life again, it introduced the Lech into the world, which are the servants of Lechfang. Who could they be? These servants, they had magical powers, they had no hooves, and many centaur were deceived by the servants of Lechfang and like allured by their magical powers, and they gave up their gifts of Achel. And these children that were deceived, those are the Lechen, and they're neither centaur or lech. That is like fawns. So like between like looking like an elf and looking like a centaur, there are fawns that exist, and those fawns are called the Lechen, and they are centaurs that were deceived and allured by the powers of the big stinky worm. Meadow elves make up a large portion of those that follow centaur beliefs. So though these are the beliefs of centaur, not every centaur believer is a centaur. A lot of people believe, a lot of meadow elves in particular who live in this area believe that the grace of Achel was kind of like stolen from them, and they would really like to have that back, and they continue to practice what they can of centaur beliefs in hopes of like bringing Achel's grace back to like the people, right? So yeah, there's a significant portion of fawns that believe this, because as I was saying, like as magic came into the world, a lot of centaur were just straight up being born as fawns as the world became like more magically like altered and stuff. So like those who descended from centaurs like have, you know, like a whole aspect of their like ancestry has just kind of been like taken from them, and it really sucks. And they would very much like their children to not. So that is where like fawn believers kind of fit into this. So the beliefs of centaurs tend to be very connected to the lands that they lived in, and it is like a very non-magical connection. There's not even really like witchcraft involved in these kind of like connections. And like historically, centaurs used to live in like small herds, and they had their overlapping ranges, and they would protect their lands in the name of Achel, and they would consult her on matters of like birth, conception, child rearing, all of that, because Achel is the life giver, you know, she is cow goddess. However, they also pray to her in times of natural disaster. They do this because they want her to soothe Eska, because like Eska is asleep and they don't want Eska to wake up, because if Eska woke up, he would shake his little fur out and everyone would fall off. So they want Achel to like tell him like to soothe him back to sleep, because when earthquakes happen, that's like Eska starting to wake, or like when there's like the wind picks up, obviously Eska is moving, so you want Achel to soothe him back to sleep, and she does this obviously because she doesn't want all of these little souls to be injured. She's a sweetheart. They don't pray to her for help in battle against the Lech, because there is this fear that if they pray for help in battle, they will eventually incite Eska to wake up and rid his back of the Lech that are like little jerks crawling all on his back and stuff. But if he does wake up, he will shake the world off his coat to do so. Like everything will be destroyed in the name of getting rid of the Lech. So it's like a huge apocalyptic end that they don't really want to do. Yeah, that's the basics of centaur beliefs. And most centaurs still kind of like hold Achel as sacred and will praise her in secret and offer her a little extra love if they are kind of forced into lindworm worship. So the original range, right, it spanned into the dry regions and the grasslands, and it went all the way to what is modern day Belmire. So it went real far. Like it was crazy far. Divine elves, they are the royal family, I guess. Other people are divine elves, but like I think that's the best way to place them. Like divine elves are kind of the royals, the nobility, and they lived in this mountain range in this little area called Belmire we have talked about. And while the centaur lived on the plains and they lived in their little region, it was very evenly balanced when like wars kind of brewed between them, because like the divine elves would retreat to the mountains where the centaur had difficulty reaching, and the centaur were just, you know, I don't want to fight a centaur. I think I've said this before. I don't really want to fight a centaur, especially not in an open field. That sounds like a horrible idea. However, what happened was this thing known as the Plague of Lilies, and it was created using Sylvan magic, was not created by the Lindworm Kingdom. It was created because of the Lindworm Kingdom in retaliation for some horrible stuff that the Lindworm Kingdom did to a group of Sylvan elves known as the Druid, and the Druid made this spell, and it ravaged the remaining centaur populations. It hit them like incredibly hard, right? Because centaurs, they are hearth. Okay, so this spell basically affected anyone who wasn't a sylvan elf, so a nature elf, or like a fox fawn. So that's the spectrum from nature powers to fox powers, and it affected everyone. And when it hit the centaur, the remaining populations, it was really bad for them, because centaurs are big horses and they've had trouble with this before. Like one of the early ways of the Divine Kingdom like taking land and stuff was through powers that they obtained through Sylvan magic that would target all hearth elves in their like hooves, and that was really bad for centaurs. And those that had like 2 feet, those fawns that stood on 2 feet, they were able to weather it a lot better than the centaur, and the centaur were like pushed out by that means. And by the time they reached the areas where like the centaur are now, they had lost control over a lot of the nature magic that they needed. Things were a little more stalematey, but as I was saying, the Plague of Lilies happened, and it devastated the remaining centaurs, and they were affected disproportionately. The magic didn't affect the centaurs as strongly as it did divine elves, and it moved very slowly. However, once a cure was created, the Lindworm Kingdom very much delayed the treatment from reaching the centaur, and a lot of them succumbed to the plague. And basically every centaur living within like Mistfall, all the centaurs in Mistfall, like everyone has had some sort of interaction with the plague, be it a loss of like loved ones, or like a horrible injury of their own, or, you know, they are the loved ones that were lost. And really sucks, really bad. We don't like the Lindworm Kingdom. And all of this leads us to Centaur Witchcraft, which is the most in-depth, I guess, I don't know, the most intact group of centaur beliefs. And they were kind of like the very last stronghold of centaurs leading up to the plague. And they have a lot going on, and we're going to talk about them. Centaur Witchcraft. What is witchcraft? A reminder. So witchcraft is basically any form of magic or worship that the Divine Kingdom thinks not good. Basically, if you are not a mage, you shouldn't be practicing anything that the Lindworm Kingdom considers to be magic. We talked about this in the case of like Lucent witches, where the witches were those fawns that were able to read. Like, it's that broad. Like, anything that seems off, you know, witchcraft it is. So, alright, to make things confusing, apparently I have a note here. Sorry, I didn't bring this up earlier, but there are a lot of centaurs that do not practice centaur beliefs at all, and are practicers of a thing called Hazalian faith, which I'm sure I've gotten into before or will get into in the future. And these people, they also don't speak the centaur language. And I bring this up to say that centaur witchcraft is almost exclusively practiced by centaurs, and all those who practice it speak the centaur language, at least the centaur language that remains kind of existing. So centaur witchcraft is functionally kind of extinct. There is a lot to this, but the Plague of Lilies was kind of like the end of it, and I'm sure it'll kind of become clear as I detail things more. But basically, like, centaur witchcraft was like incredibly tied to the lands that they lived on, and over time lords have like taken over these lands and made them inaccessible to the centaur. Most of the centaur witches were kind of forced into this very small area that was like a deciduous kind of region, and a lot different to like where they used to live in like these more grassland areas. And furthermore, like over time, like as they were pushed into these groups, they're just like, because they're centaurs, they're big, they eat grass and stuff, you know, and other things, because they're also peoples. And they had lots of land that they lived on, and as this group became more and more compressed, there was a lot of like issues with like food scarcity, and they couldn't really forage and maintain the lands in the ways that were sustainable. This caused a lot of trouble, and like a lot of them who would have otherwise foraged were kind of pressured into moving into the villages and rural areas that the fawns were living in, and taking up kind of work there. And most of them ended up kind of working on fields for mages and whatnot. And that was what was going on. It kind of sucked. It definitely sucked. Usually they would live on like the off-season fields. So like as a field would become depleted of nutrients, like the centaur would live on that field and then rotate, crop rotation style, you know? Regardless, even that life became difficult for them because of the Plague of Lilies, I guess, is a big factor. So like when the Plague of Lilies hit, as I was saying, it didn't affect the centaur as badly. It moved through them very slowly. Like the Plague of Lilies, basically like flowers grow through you and slowly kill you. It's terrible, awful, but it worked really slow on the centaurs, and they were really hopeful that there would be like a cure, and a lot of effort was taken to keep the lilies from like growing, and a lot would have survived if the cure had been delivered promptly to them. But of course, as I was saying, it was delayed. And like, as these lilies grew and took over their lands, and like, as I was saying, they were forced into these much more like lush areas that the lilies really could get a foothold. Like the lilies not only killed people, but they took over the fields, and like the already dwindling food was then full of like these lilies, so a lot of people starved, or they just kind of gave up and searched these cursed lands and searched for food and ended up infected. Most that didn't end up doing that like ended up dying of starvation. So it was like either you become infected or you starve, or both. And when aid reached them, the main concern of the kingdom wasn't really protecting the centaurs or anything. It was about curing the lands and making them usable again so that they could have like their populations move in. And they really didn't care about the centaur. They really don't like centaur. And so like they came in and they assessed the centaur that existed still, and those that were deemed kind of like capable of healing were offered the cure, and those that were like seen as like unable to like recover, they were executed for their sake. And like, so before the Plague of Lilies, there was like about like 66,000 witches, and by the end of the plague it was like 400. So that's why it's so close to like extinct, right? And those that survived, those remaining like couple hundred witches that survive, like their families ended up being broken apart, and a lot of people were separated, and the remaining witches like now live alone on like different homesteads and work like alongside like horses, and their life is pretty miserable. And it is unlikely that enough centaur are going to be able to like get back together, reunite, and continue on like their lineage and stuff. And that's kind of where the functional extinction comes from. Things are bad for the centaur, guys. And this is what I was saying, like forever ago I was talking about a group of jerk centaurs who totally, you know, they were jerks. But not all centaurs, right? What are the beliefs of the centaur witches? Let's go in depth, because it's fun talking about centaurs. Let's talk about like pre horrible things, right? So they believe in the same creation story as common centaurs. So they believe that the world is on Eska's back and he's on top of Lechfang, and the goddess Achel made home for all the centaurs. So they believe all that. They also believe that the serpent tried to wake twice, and that the Lech were made, and the Lechen are the fawns, and blah blah blah. So on like a technical level, centaur are incapable of magic. However, the witches have found something similar to magic in their relations to like their gods, so Achel and Eska. So in their lands, they find many sacred spaces, and they keep them holy, and they do that so that they can speak to the gods. They believe that these sacred spaces are full of like a type of magic, and that you need to give it time to replenish itself. So you can't like overgraze on a field of magic. Sorry. So it's possible basically to overuse a magical space and turn it into like a desert of sacred power. And most of these sacred spaces, of course, have now been destroyed by the Lindworm Kingdom. Anyways, so like mage magic is called Nakfen, and it comes from Lechfang. So that's the belief. So like mage magic, bad magic, Nakfen comes from Lechfang. Witchcraft is called Alm, and it is the power that is created between gods and people, gods and the souls of people, so gods and witches. It's like the connection between people and like God, whatever. And this connection is believed to be something that gods cannot create on their own. Alm is created with Achel in a way that is similar to like the connection between like a mother and like her newborn child. And like Alm that is created with Eska is created in a similar way to like death, when like a spirit and body become one with the earth. So like spacey, fancy, spiritual stuff. Centaurs keep the element of hearth in their hearts, and like home to them is their family. Like they don't have like a homestead. And in places of Alm, and in places that resonate with hearth, it is said that Achel is always present. So if you always keep your family in your heart, Achel is always with you. And like prayer and praise doesn't mean anything to her. Like Lechfang desires to be prayed to and praised, but Achel does not care for that. Neither does Eska, and all they care for is the love between them and the people of the land. So centaur witches, they don't have a huge idea of like land ownership in a way. Like anyone can be connected with any land. Like it's not really for them to decide. They kind of like understood how like meadow elves and fauns would build villages and kind of create their hearths and homes there, and like that makes sense to them, but they don't believe that they own like the land per se. And like opinions were like mixed on the fauns and the villages and like what that meant. And like while some amount of alm can be created in like having like a home and hearth, it's like not as potent as like these sacred spaces that are like given time to like grow and breathe on their own or whatever. So family structures, as I was saying, families got really broken up by the Divine Kingdom when they came in. And a large part of this is because like the family structures of Centaur are very non-traditional, and they were considered to be too animalistic for the Divine Kingdom. Everyone was kind of divided into a proper family. So those that did like end up being able to stay with another centaur, it is weird, man. So like before the plague even happened, before everyone was like even further broken apart, like as centaur were forced to move into like villages and the more orthodox areas, they were really forced to fit themselves into these more like typical family structures, and that really sucked. Okay, so Centaur society, as seen by the Divine Kingdom, was like a bunch of different herds, and there was typically one or two males, and they had a bunch of wives. However, that's not really what was going on socially there. So Centaurs lived in a very more like matriarchal kind of social system. So they would live in these groups of women, and they would have their children, and then they would have like the one or two fathers, and then they would have like elders. So like the mother and father of like the matriarch, and then like her aunts usually. And like the leader, the matriarch of the herd, would then be like a woman. However, there is a little more to that, because in Centaur society, there are like 3 sexes rather than like male and female. There's like male, female, and then there's like super female, the matriarchs. And like this is like kind of determined at birth. It's not the binary, it's the trinary. Anyways, the sex trinary is male, female, and super female. So males are males, easy peasy, because their society focuses around the cow goddess, Hazel, Achel, and milk is always like sacred in like these hearth cultures. The capability of producing milk is very important. I had to say that a lot because the plosives were maddening. But yeah, making milk, very important. Okay, so basically what determines then whether or not you're a matriarch is whether or not you have an udder, or are capable of an udder, I suppose. That is assigned at birth. And the reason this is assigned at birth, and let's just like talk about world building here, but did you know that male horses don't have nipples? Fascinating, I know. So if you are born without male horse titty, I guess that doesn't exist, but if you were born without, then you are considered to be like more masculine and not a matriarch. And that's like the divide of the 3 sexes within Centaur society, or at least within these witches, and I imagine other groups too, probably. So yeah, so there's functionally like 3 sexes in how they would break their society down. The Lindorn Kingdom did not see this to be the case, and they thought it was really gross if you were a matriarch. So like if you are born a matriarch, if you were assigned matriarch at birth, you are expected to eventually form your own herd. And the more masculine women, just the regular, not super women, like they are expected to either follow their sisters or follow their best friend, their best girlfriend. And you go off and you form a herd. And then, meanwhile, herds of bachelors, typically brothers, would then form, and they're bros. When a bachelor herd shows up and meets a lady herd, the women would then look over the men and determine the best ones, usually just one, sometimes 2. They were very picky. They all the ladies in the herd, they agree on a fella to be in their herd, and the matriarch would have final say. And obviously there was some dramas that would unfold. My goodness, the Centaur soap operas you could write, I'm sure. You pick a fella, and then he ends up being the father of everyone's children. And like the ideal male centaur is one that's really vigilant, one that's like protective, but most importantly, you have to be like a super good dad. You need to have like really good emotional and like social acuity, because like you have to be the father of like all of these children and you have to do a good job of it. And so like those are like the traits of like the perfect guy for Centaur ladies. And like obviously when the Divine Kingdom took over, none of this nuance mattered to them, and they didn't care about any other gender or sex roles, and they were forced into a binary and forced to pair bond, or at least very much pressured to, and matriarchs were considered to be gross and too animalistic, and if you were to ever give udder milk to a child, you were basically stunting their brains and leaving them as dim-witted as animals, and you're a bad person if you do that. Obviously not the case back in the day, am I right? So, as I was saying, most Centaur witchcraft is focused around Alm. So, like, the magical connection between people and the gods. And when one creates Alm, the results are, like, infinite. Like, all sorts of things can happen. So like, and like these creations often then become these sacred places. So like one example of Alm is the famine tree, which is Niechini. And the tree was created with the Alm that formed between Eska and a mother named Niechini. And the famine tree grew when Niechini buried her daughter who had died in the famine. And like her love for her daughter and her want to see her safe then created Alm. So yeah, so she buried her daughter in the dry earth, and she thanked Eska for like all of the meals that they'd been able to like eat within life, and there was just like much love, earnest love, and Niechini passed away, and in doing so, like the Alm that was created turned into a tree, and this tree forever would then bloom and bear fruit whenever the soils became dry, basically. And it's said that like Niechini forever cradles her daughter in the roots of the tree, and her soul is forever nourished by like her mother's eternal love. And of course the Divine Kingdom like cut down Niechini, and the wood was used to make a very short-lived fire, and with the powers of Lechfeng, the roots were rotted away. And that's because Lechfeng hates mothers, because Lechfeng has a bad relationship with his own mother. That's why he tried really hard to eat a Chell, because he hates moms. Anyways, another example of Alm was like the birthing meadow, which was where most centaurs ended up like taking their first steps. And it's a place where foals are like birthed, and because of the Alm of so many mothers, so much birth, so much love, it created like a sacred space where births were always simple, successful, great time. And though the birthing meadow remains in existence, it is now on the private land of a lord, and no one has access to it. You know, at this point, it doesn't matter anymore, I guess. Yeah, so like a lot of centaur customs centered around like birth and the rearing of children. And a lot of that has to do with like, obviously, like cultures just tend to have this aspect to them. Like reproduction is just kind of a part of cultures. Like it's there, it's important. But also centaurs, biologically, they have very long pregnancies, so they tend to have pregnancies that last either like 2 to 4 years, anywhere in there. And baby centaurs, they are typically born more like toddlers, and they are walking and saying words shortly after birth. So they're more like horses in that way, where they need to be up and at 'em, but they're also more like elephants, where it's like, you know, there's a lot to develop. So like the ones that are like born earlier, they tend to be a lot more like human babies, where they're like not completely baked, and like, you know, they're the ugly baby birds of the centaur world. You know, they're kind of harder to take care of because you have to like swaddle them and carry them and all that. feed them, and they're just the whole thing, ain't they? Whereas those that are born like up and walking are a lot easier for herd life, I guess. But anyways, because there's like such a long time, there's like a lot of like important stages of pregnancy and all sorts of different like sacred spaces, all sorts of different places of Alm that one would visit during the gestation of a child. And like centaurs in the womb are said to like need lessons and to be like taught before they enter the world. So like all of these things are very important. And as with most hearth worship, like milk is sacred, right? As we were saying. So children, especially those of the matriarch, nurse for like most of their early life. The matriarch is able to bless children that share, you know, her milk or whatever. Like that's usually something that is important. Yeah, then the matriarch's kind of like the heart of the family, and everyone's half siblings, I guess. And so like when matriarchs pass away, whether like the elder matriarch or a current one, it's like really difficult for all that are like linked to her. And those that made a lot of like Alm, they leave like a huge impact. And if you lack connection with a matriarch in your heart, it's very difficult, and it is said to leave you prone to like sickness and like bad fortune. And the remedy for this is to bind the matriarch to the land, to her land, kind of create a sacred space, and then to seek out a connection with Eska, to connect her to the earth. And in a similar way, male society, bachelor groups, male centaurs tend to seek out Alm with Eska. So many males, they go on like to find like their peace, their spirituality within Eska rather than Achel and Hearth. So many of them formed very deep connections between themselves and the land, much like other like Sylvan witches. So like, I think we discussed the druids. Yeah, we did. And the druids, they would, their matriarchs would find a connection with a tree. So it's sort of similar to that. And so like a lot of men eventually, when they pass, they end up like enmeshed with like nature spirits and things. And yeah, so like once they were cut off from their land, men in particular, I mean all of them were, but like a lot of men ended up being very lost and kind of like purposeless. It was a lot of the men that ended up leaving in search of like purpose outside of like Mistfall, and instead a lot of them just ended up working, and a lot of like that deeper meaning and like almond connection ended up being kind of lost from their reach, which sucks. So that is the sad life of centaurs, man. Centaurs must I was talking to my wife about this, Ursula, and she was saying how gay centaurs must have been, and honestly, yeah, but have you considered super gay, like super lesbians? So like, because there's like the 3 sex groups, like what if 2 matriarchs fell in love and like they became a power couple, had a herd together? That would be so good, and I love that for them. And prime lesbians. I don't know what I'm saying. Anyways, thank you for listening. I'm going to be talking more about Mistfall in the future. However, in the future, I would like to talk about other things. And we are almost done talking about the Divine Kingdom. And I want to know if we want to go and talk about the duchies, or do we want to go and talk about the Sylvan Forest? So do we want to go south, or do we want to go north? You tell me in the comments. All right, goodbye. I don't know. Goodbye. Sorry. Like, comment, and subscribe, I guess.